The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty town square of Millbrook, painting the weathered buildings in shades of gold and amber. A crowd had gathered around the makeshift auction block, their voices creating a low murmur that mixed with the sound of horses stamping and harnesses creaking. But this wasn't an auction for livestock or farm equipment. This was something far more heartbreaking, something that spoke to the harsh realities of frontier life in 1887. 17-year-old Mercy Callahan stood on that block, her worn calico dress patched and faded, clutching a bundle wrapped in what had once been a white blanket. The bundle was small, precious, and moved occasionally with the soft stirrings of new life. Her newborn daughter, barely 3 weeks old, was all she had left in this unforgiving world. Mercy's green eyes, once bright with the dreams of youth, now held the weight of loss and desperation. Her auburn hair, though clean, hung limply around her shoulders, and her face bore the pallor of someone who had known too much hardship for her tender years. The auctioneer, a portly man named Silas Wheaton, cleared his throat and called for attention. His voice boomed across the square, carrying the practiced cadence of someone who had sold everything from cattle to kitchen tables. But today he was selling people, and the discomfort in his manner was evident to those who knew him well. "Ladies and gentlemen," Wheaton began, his voice wavering slightly, "we have here a young woman, strong and capable, along with her infant child. The girl's had her troubles, lost her folks to the fever last winter, but she's willing to work hard for a good Christian family. Starting bid is $50 for the pair." Mercy felt her knees wobble as she heard herself and her baby reduced to mere commodities. The bundle in her arms stirred, and she looked down at the tiny face peeking out from the blanket. Little Rose had her father's dark hair but Mercy's green eyes, and she was the only good thing to come from a relationship that had ended in abandonment and shame. When the traveling preacher who had promised to marry her disappeared with the church's collection money, Mercy found herself alone, pregnant, and facing a town's judgment. The bidding started slowly. A few farmers raised their hands, seeing potential in young, strong hands for fieldwork. Mrs. Henderson, who ran the boarding house, considered the girl for kitchen help but balked at the added burden of a baby. The voices around Mercy became a blur of numbers and negotiations, as if she were no more than a piece of furniture being haggled over. Sitting on his horse at the edge of the crowd, 43-year-old Samuel Morrison watched the proceedings with a growing sense of unease. His weathered hands gripped the reins tighter as he observed the young woman's quiet dignity in the face of such humiliation. Samuel owned the largest ranch in the county, a spread of 15,000 acres that he had built from nothing over 20 years of backbreaking work. He was known as a fair man, though stern, and his ranch hands respected him for his honesty and the fact that he worked alongside them rather than simply giving orders from his porch. But Samuel Morrison was also a man haunted by regret. 10 years earlier, he had been married to Elizabeth, a gentle woman from back east who had come to love the harsh beauty of the frontier. They had tried for years to have children, and when Elizabeth finally became pregnant, their joy knew no bounds. But frontier medicine was crude, and complications during childbirth had taken both Elizabeth and their son. Samuel had never fully recovered from that loss, throwing himself into his work and keeping the world at arm's length. As the bidding continued, Samuel found himself studying the young woman's face. There was something in her bearing that reminded him of Elizabeth, a quiet strength that refused to be broken even in the darkest circumstances. When the baby in her arms made a soft sound, Mercy's entire demeanor softened, and she whispered something too quiet for the crowd to hear. It was clear that despite her desperate circumstances, her love for that child was fierce and uncompromising. The bidding had reached $75 when Jonas Fletcher, a man known for his harsh treatment of hired help, raised his hand. Samuel knew Fletcher's reputation. The man worked his laborers to exhaustion, paid them poorly, and had no patience for what he called feminine weakness. The thought of that young mother and her baby ending up in Fletcher's hands made Samuel's stomach turn. $80. Fletcher called out, his voice carrying a note of satisfaction. The auctioneer looked around for additional bids, and when none came immediately, he began his countdown. $80 going once, going twice. $100. The voice that rang out clear and strong was Samuel's own, though he hadn't consciously decided to speak. Every head in the crowd turned toward him, and he felt the weight of their stares. Mercy's eyes found his across the square, and for a moment, time seemed suspended. He saw hope flicker in her green eyes, mixed with uncertainty and a desperate kind of gratitude. Fletcher scowled and raised his bid to 110, but Samuel immediately countered with 120. The crowd began to murmur with interest. Samuel Morrison was known to be careful with his money, and his sudden interest in this auction surprised many who knew him. 150, Samuel said firmly, his voice carrying a finality that made Fletcher think twice about continuing. After a moment's hesitation, Fletcher shook his head and stepped back. The auctioneer brought down his gavel with a sharp crack that seemed to echo across the square. Sold to Mr. Samuel Morrison for $150. As the crowd began to disperse, Samuel dismounted and approached the auction block. Up close, he could see that Mercy was even younger than he had initially thought, and the dark circles under her eyes spoke of sleepless nights and worry that no teenager should have to bear. She held her baby protectively, as if afraid that even now, someone might try to separate them. "Miss," Samuel said quietly, removing his hat in a gesture of respect. "I'm Samuel Morrison. I have a ranch about 5 miles west of town." Mercy studied his face carefully. She had heard of Samuel Morrison, of course. Everyone in the county knew of the successful rancher who kept to himself. She had expected someone harder, more imposing, but the man before her had kind eyes, though they held their own share of sadness. "I'm Mercy Callahan," she replied softly, "and this is Rose." Samuel glanced down at the baby, who was sleeping peacefully despite the commotion around them. Something in his chest tightened at the sight of the tiny, perfect features. "Miss Callahan," he said carefully, "I want you to understand that I'm not looking for anything improper. My ranch is large, and I could use help with the house and cooking for the hands. You'll have your own room, and your daughter will be safe and provided for. I'll pay you fair wages, and when you've saved enough to make your own way, you'll be free to leave." Mercy felt tears prick at her eyes. After weeks of facing judgment and scorn from the townspeople, this stranger's simple kindness was almost overwhelming. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you help us?" Samuel was quiet for a long moment, looking out across the square where people were going about their daily business, unaware of the small drama that had just played out. "Because everyone deserves a chance," he said finally. "And because I know what it's like to lose everything that matters." The wagon ride to the Morrison Ranch was quiet, filled with the sound of wheels on dirt and the gentle creaking of leather. Mercy sat beside Samuel on the driver's seat, Rose cradled in her arms, watching the landscape change from dusty town streets to rolling hills dotted with cattle. The ranch, when it came into view, was more impressive than she had imagined. The main house was large and well built, with a wide front porch and windows that gleamed in the afternoon sun. Outbuildings dotted the property, and she could see ranch hands working with horses in a distant corral. Samuel helped her down from the wagon and led her to the house. The interior was clean but sparse, with the functional furniture of a man who cared more about durability than decoration. There were few feminine touches, and Mercy could sense the absence of a woman's hand in the arrangement of things. "This will be your room," Samuel said, opening a door to reveal a modest but comfortable bedroom with a window that looked out over the ranch. "There's a cradle in the corner there. I made it some time ago." Mercy didn't need to ask why he had made a cradle. The careful craftsmanship and the layer of dust that covered it told its own story. She felt a fresh wave of gratitude toward this man who was showing her more kindness than she had experienced in months. Over the following weeks, Mercy settled into life at the Morrison Ranch. She proved to be an excellent cook, having learned from necessity after her parents' deaths, and she brought an efficiency to the household management that Samuel had never experienced. The ranch hands, initially skeptical of having a woman and baby around, soon came to appreciate the hot meals and the sense of home that Mercy's presence brought to the place. Rose thrived in the clean air and peaceful environment. She was a good baby, content to sleep in her cradle while Mercy worked, and quick to smile when anyone paid attention to her. The ranch hands, tough men who had lived hard lives, found themselves going out of their way to catch a glimpse of the baby's smile. Samuel watched these changes with a mixture of pleasure and pain. The house felt alive in a way it hadn't since Elizabeth's death, but that very aliveness reminded him constantly of what he had lost. He found himself avoiding the house during the day, staying out with the cattle or finding repairs that needed his attention in the far corners of the ranch. One evening in late autumn, as the first frost painted the grass silver, Samuel returned to the house to find Mercy sitting on the front porch, Rose sleeping in her arms. The young woman was humming softly, a melody that Samuel recognized as one Elizabeth used to sing. "It's getting cold out here," he said gently. "You should come inside." Mercy looked up at him, and in the lamplight from the windows, he could see that she had been crying. "I got a letter today," she said quietly. "From my aunt back in Missouri. She heard about what happened to me. She wants me to come live with her family." Samuel felt something cold settle in his stomach. He had known this day would come, had even encouraged Mercy to write to her relatives, but now that it was here, he found himself unprepared for the sense of loss that washed over him. "That's good news," he said, sitting down on the porch steps. "Family is important. She wants me to give Rose up for adoption," Mercy continued, her voice breaking slightly. "She says an unmarried mother would be a scandal in their community, and that Rose would have a better life with a proper family." "What do you want to do?" Samuel asked, though he thought he already knew the answer. "I can't give her up," Mercy whispered fiercely. "She's all I have. She's the best part of me. But I don't have anywhere else to go. I've saved some money, but not enough to make a real start somewhere new." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the sound of the wind in the grass and the distant lowing of cattle. Samuel found himself studying Mercy's profile in the moonlight, noting the strength in her young face and the protective way she held her daughter. "You could stay," he said suddenly, the words coming out before he had fully thought them through. Mercy turned to look at him, surprise evident in her expression. "I mean," Samuel continued, feeling heat rise in his cheeks, "the arrangement we have is working well. You're a good worker, and the men respect you. Rose is no trouble, and she brings something to this place that's been missing." "Mr. Morrison," Mercy said softly, "people already talk. If I stay much longer without a proper arrangement, they'll assume. Then we'll make it proper." Samuel said, his voice gaining strength as the idea took shape in his mind. "Marry me, Mercy." "It doesn't have to be. It can be a marriage of convenience, a partnership. You'll have security and a name for Rose, and I'll have someone to help run the house and ranch." Mercy stared at him, her mouth slightly open in shock. "You don't know what you're asking. I'm not pure. I have a child out of wedlock. People will judge you for taking me as a wife." "I don't care what people think," Samuel said firmly. "I care about doing what's right, and what's right is making sure you and Rose have a home and protection." "But you don't love me," Mercy said, and there was something vulnerable in her voice that made Samuel's heart ache. "No," he admitted quietly, "but I care about you both, and maybe that's enough to build something good on." Mercy was quiet for a long time, rocking Rose gently as she considered his proposal. Finally, she looked up at him with those green eyes that had haunted his thoughts for months. "If we do this," she said slowly, "I want to be a real wife to you. Not just a housekeeper with a marriage certificate. I want to try to build something real, something that might grow into love given time." Samuel felt his heart skip a beat. He had expected her to accept the practical arrangement he had offered, but her words suggested something deeper, something that both thrilled and terrified him. "Are you sure?" he asked. "I'm not an easy man, Mercy. I've been alone for a long time and I'm set in my ways, and I loved my first wife very much. I can't promise that I'll ever love anyone the way I loved Elizabeth." "I'm not asking you to forget her," Mercy replied. "I'm just asking you to give us a chance to find our own kind of love." They were married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the small church in Millbrook. Mercy wore a dress she had sewn herself from fabric Samuel had bought her, a soft blue that brought out her eyes. Rose, now 4 months old, slept peacefully in Samuel's arms during the ceremony, and when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Samuel kissed Mercy gently on the forehead, a promise of tenderness if not yet love. The early months of their marriage were awkward but not unhappy. They were both careful with each other, polite and considerate, but there was a distance between them that seemed impossible to bridge. Samuel continued to sleep in his own room, and Mercy didn't push for more intimacy than he was ready to give. But gradually, small moments began to accumulate. Samuel would find himself lingering in the kitchen in the mornings, enjoying the sight of Mercy humming as she cooked breakfast. Mercy would catch herself watching Samuel work with the horses, admiring his quiet competence and the gentle way he spoke to the animals. When Rose began to crawl, Samuel would spend evenings sitting on the floor with her, his serious face softening into smiles as she pulled herself up on his legs. The turning point came on a cold February night when Rose fell ill with a fever. Mercy sat up with her through the night, trying everything she could think of to bring the baby's temperature down. When Samuel found them in the early morning hours, Mercy was crying quietly, exhausted and terrified. "I don't know what else to do," she whispered. "She's so hot and she won't eat." Without a word, Samuel took the baby from her arms and examined Rose carefully. His own experience with fever and sickness on the frontier had taught him to recognize the signs of serious illness. "We need to get her to the doctor in town," he said firmly. Now, the ride to town in the pre-dawn darkness was the longest of Mercy's life. Samuel drove the wagon as fast as he dared on the rough roads, while Mercy held Rose and tried to keep her warm. The baby's breathing was labored, and her small body felt frighteningly fragile. Dr. Hamilton roused from his bed, examined Rose quickly and diagnosed pneumonia. For the next 3 days, Samuel and Mercy took turns sitting by the baby's bedside in the doctor's office, watching over her as she fought for her life. Samuel barely left the building, sleeping in a chair when exhaustion overcame him, and Mercy saw a side of her husband she had never witnessed before. On the third night, as Rosie's fever finally broke and her breathing eased, Samuel found Mercy crying quietly in the hallway. "She's going to be all right," he said gently, putting his hand on her shoulder. "I know," Mercy sobbed. I'm so grateful. For you, for everything you've done for us. I don't know how to repay you." Samuel turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "You don't need to repay me, Mercy. You're my wife and Rose is my daughter now. Taking care of you both isn't a burden, it's a privilege. Do you mean that?" Mercy asked, searching his face in the dim lamplight. "I mean it," Samuel replied, and for the first time since their marriage, he kissed her properly, with tenderness and the beginning of something that might grow into love. Spring brought new life to the ranch and to the Morrison family. Rose, fully recovered from her illness, began to walk, tottering around the house and yard with the determined concentration of the very young. Mercy planted a garden behind the house, filling it with vegetables and flowers that added color and beauty to the practical landscape of the ranch. Samuel found himself changing in ways he hadn't expected. The careful distance he had maintained began to dissolve as he watched Mercy's quiet strength and the joy she took in small things. When she laughed at Rose's antics or sang while she worked, he felt something in his chest that he had thought was dead forever. One evening in May, as they sat on the porch watching Rose chase fireflies in the grass, Mercy spoke quietly. "I've been thinking about names," she said. "Names?" Samuel asked, confused. "For Rose. She's been calling you Papa for weeks now, but her last name is still Callahan. I thought if you wanted, we could change it to Morrison. Make it official." Samuel felt emotion tighten his throat. Over the months, he had come to love the little girl as if she were his own blood, but he hadn't dared to hope that Mercy would want to make that connection legal. "I'd like that very much," he said quietly. "I'd be honored to have her carry my name. And I've been thinking about other things too," Mercy continued, her cheeks pink in the evening light. "About us. About whether you might want to try for children of our own someday." Samuel turned to look at her fully, seeing the hope and vulnerability in her expression. The fear that had gripped him since Elizabeth's death still lingered, but it was no longer the overwhelming force it had once been. "I'd like that too," he admitted. "I won't lie and say I'm not scared, but yes, I'd like that very much." That night, for the first time since their marriage, Samuel came to Mercy's room. Their coming together was gentle and careful, full of tenderness rather than passion, but it marked a new beginning for them both. By the time autumn returned to the ranch, Mercy was pregnant with their second child. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, and Samuel found himself cautiously optimistic in a way he hadn't been in years. Rose, now walking confidently and beginning to form simple sentences, seemed to understand that something special was happening and would often pat Mercy's growing belly and babble to her, baby brother or sister. The birth, when it came in early spring, was difficult but not dangerous. Dr. Hamilton had come to the ranch and stayed for 2 days, and when Samuel finally heard the cry of his newborn son, he felt a joy so intense it brought tears to his eyes. "Is perfect," Mercy whispered, exhausted but radiant, as she placed the baby in Samuel's arms. Samuel looked down at his son, seeing Mercy's eyes and his own stubborn chin already evident in the tiny features. "What shall we call him?" "I was thinking James," Mercy said softly. "After your father." Samuel had told her stories about his father over the long winter evenings, and the fact that she remembered and honored that connection moved him deeply. "James Morrison," he said, testing the name. I like it. As he held his son, with Rose climbing up on the bed to see her new brother and Mercy watching them all with tired but happy eyes, Samuel realized that somewhere along the way, he had fallen in love with his wife. Not the desperate, all-consuming love he had felt for Elizabeth, but something quieter and deeper, built on shared struggles and daily kindnesses and the gradual recognition of true partnership. I love you, he said suddenly, the words coming out without conscious thought. Mercy's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of joy. I love you too, she whispered back. The years that followed were not without their challenges. The ranch faced hard winters and dry summers, cattle rustlers and economic downturns. Rose grew into a spirited young girl who could ride better than most grown men and had inherited her mother's stubborn streak. James proved to be a gentle soul who loved books as much as horses, and 2 more children followed, daughters named Elizabeth and Hope. But through all the ups and downs of frontier life, the Morrison family remained strong. Samuel and Mercy's love deepened with each passing year, built on mutual respect and shared dreams. Rose never questioned that Samuel was her father, and when she was old enough to understand her origins, she felt only gratitude for the man who had claimed both her and her mother when they most needed protection. On their 10th wedding anniversary, as they stood on the porch of their expanded house, watching their children play in the yard, Mercy reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. Do you ever think about that day at the auction? She asked Samuel. Every day, he replied honestly. It was the day my real life began. I was so scared, Mercy admitted. I thought Rose and I were going to end up with someone who would treat us badly or worse, that we might be separated. I couldn't let that happen, Samuel said, putting his arm around her. From the moment I saw you holding her, I knew you belonged together. And somehow, I knew you both belonged here. Do you think she'll understand someday how close we came to losing everything? Samuel watched Rose, now 12 and teaching 6-year-old James how to braid a rope, her face serious with concentration. I think she already understands what matters, he said. She knows she's loved, she knows she's safe, and she knows this is her home. That's enough. As the sun set over the ranch, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Samuel Morrison looked at the life he had built with Mercy and their children. He thought about the man he had been 10 years ago, bitter and closed off, living in the shadow of his grief. That man could never have imagined this happiness, this sense of completeness. Sometimes the greatest acts of love begin with the simplest decisions. A decision to speak up when silence would be easier. A decision to see dignity where others see only desperation. A decision to offer sanctuary to those who have nowhere else to turn. On that long-ago morning in Millbrook, Samuel Morrison had thought he was simply rescuing a young woman and her child from an uncertain fate. He had no way of knowing that in saving them, he would also save himself, transforming his lonely ranch into a home filled with laughter and love, and his heart from a place of sorrow into one of joy. The frontier was a hard place that demanded hard choices, but it was also a place where second chances were possible, where the past didn't have to define the future, and where love could grow in the most unlikely circumstances. For the Morrison family, every sunrise brought new proof that sometimes the most broken people can help heal each other, and that the families we choose can be just as strong as the ones we're born into. Years passed like pages turning in a well-worn book, each season bringing new chapters to the Morrison family story. Rose grew into a remarkable young woman, inheriting her mother's strength and her adoptive father's quiet wisdom. She never forgot the story of how Samuel had saved her and her mother, and it shaped her into someone who always looked out for those who needed help. When Rose was 16, she encountered a situation that would test everything she had learned about courage and compassion. A new family had moved to the area, the Kellys, and they had a son named Thomas who was born with a withered arm. The other young people in town often mocked him, but Rose saw past his physical limitation to the intelligent, kind person beneath. "Papa," she said to Samuel one evening, "why are people so cruel to those who are different?" Samuel looked up from the ledger he was working on, recognizing the serious tone in his daughter's voice. "Fear mostly," he replied thoughtfully. "People are afraid of what they don't understand, and sometimes that fear comes out as cruelty." "You weren't afraid of Mama and me," Rose pointed out. "Even though we were different, unwanted. I saw something in your mother that reminded me of strength," Samuel said. "And I saw something in you that reminded me of hope. Sometimes we have to look deeper than what's on the surface." Rose took his words to heart and began spending time with Thomas Kelly, teaching him to ride and including him in activities with her siblings. Her friendship with him gradually changed how others in the community saw him, and by the time harvest season came around, Thomas was accepted as part of the group of young people in the area. The lesson wasn't lost on the younger Morrison children either. James, now 13, had inherited his father's gentle nature and his mother's sense of justice. Elizabeth at 11 was spirited and outspoken, never hesitating to defend those who couldn't defend themselves. Hope, the youngest at 8, had a gift for seeing the good in everyone and bringing out the best in people around her. One autumn evening, as the family gathered around the dinner table, Mercy watched her children chattering and laughing together, and she felt overwhelmed by gratitude. The scared, desperate girl who had stood on that auction block seemed like a different person entirely, someone from another lifetime. "What are you thinking about?" Samuel asked quietly, noticing her contemplative mood. "Just remembering," Mercy replied, reaching over to squeeze his hand, remembering how different everything could have been. "But it wasn't different," Samuel said firmly. "This is what was meant to be." Later that evening, after the children had gone to bed, Samuel and Mercy sat on their porch swing, watching the stars emerge in the clear night sky. The ranch spread out before them, peaceful and prosperous, the result of years of hard work and careful planning. "I've been thinking," Mercy said, leaning against Samuel's shoulder, "about that young woman who works at the general store." "Mary Patterson," Samuel nodded. He had noticed the girl, barely 18 and clearly struggling to make ends meet. Her parents had died in a wagon accident the previous winter, leaving her completely alone. "She reminds me of myself at that age," Mercy continued, "trying so hard to be strong, but scared and alone inside." "What are you suggesting?" Samuel asked, though he thought he already knew. "We have that empty room above the barn. It's small, but it's clean and warm. And we could use help with the increased household work now that we're taking in more ranch hands for the winter." Samuel smiled in the darkness. Even after all these years, Mercy's generous heart continued to amaze him. "You want to offer her a place here?" "I want to offer her what you offered me," Mercy said simply. "A chance." The next day, Samuel and Mercy drove into town together, ostensibly to pick up supplies, but really to speak with Mary Patterson. They found her sweeping the front steps of the general store, her thin frame bent over the broom, her movements wary despite her youth. "Miss Patterson," Mercy called out gently. The girl looked up, startled. She knew who the Morrisons were, of course. Everyone in the county knew of the successful ranch family, and she had heard whispers about how Samuel Morrison had married a woman with a questionable past. But she had also heard that they were fair and kind employers. "Mers Morrison," Mary said, smoothing her worn apron nervously. "Mr. Morrison, how can I help you?" "Actually," Mercy said with a warm smile, "we were hoping we could help you. We're looking for someone to assist with household work at the ranch, and we wondered if you might be interested in the position." Mary's eyes widened. She had been barely scraping by on her wages from the store, and the loneliness of her small room above the millinery shop was sometimes overwhelming. I don't know what to say," she stammered. "What would the work involve?" "Cooking, cleaning, helping with the children when needed." Samuel explained. "Would provide room and board plus fair wages. It's honest work, and you'd be treated with respect." Mary felt tears prick at her eyes. It had been so long since anyone had shown her genuine kindness that she had almost forgotten what it felt like. "Why would you do this for me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mercy stepped closer, her expression gentle and understanding. "Because everyone deserves a chance to build a better life," she said. "And because someone once did the same for me." Mary Patterson became part of the Morrison household that winter, and like Mercy before her, she found not just employment but a place where she belonged. The children adopted her as an older sister, and she proved to be invaluable help to Mercy in managing the increasingly complex household of a growing ranch. As spring arrived and the ranch prepared for another busy season, Samuel found himself reflecting on the patterns of his life. He had begun as a man who lost everything, who closed his heart to avoid further pain. But somehow, through Mercy's love and the growth of their family, he had become someone who opened his home to others, who saw need and responded with generosity. "You know," he said to Mercy one morning as they watched their children and Mary working together to prepare the garden for planting, "I used to think that strength meant standing alone, depending on no one. And now," Mercy asked, slipping her hand into his. Now I know that real strength comes from the connections we make, the people we choose to love and protect. The Morrison Ranch had become more than just a successful business. It had become a place where people found second chances, where the discarded and forgotten could rebuild their lives. Word spread gradually through the county, and over the years, other young people in desperate circumstances found their way to the Morrison door. Some stayed for a season, others for years. A few became permanent parts of the extended family. Each person who passed through brought their own story, their own struggles and triumphs, adding to the rich tapestry of life at the ranch. Rose grew up watching her parents' generosity and learning that true wealth wasn't measured in cattle or land, but in the lives you touched and the love you shared. When she eventually married Thomas Kelly, their wedding was celebrated not just by the Morrison family, but by dozens of people whose lives had been changed by the kindness they had witnessed at the ranch. James followed in his father's footsteps, taking over more of the ranch operations as Samuel grew older, but he also inherited his parents' compassion. He established a small school on the ranch property, ensuring that all the children in the area, regardless of their families' circumstances, had access to education. Elizabeth became a teacher, traveling to remote settlements to educate children who had no other opportunity to learn. Hope, true to her name, became known throughout the territory for her ability to bring comfort to the sick and grieving, following in the footsteps of the local doctor and eventually establishing a small clinic in the growing town of Millbrook. As Samuel entered his 60th year, he often walked the boundaries of his ranch in the early morning hours, taking stock of all that had grown from that single moment of decision 23 years earlier. The land was more prosperous than ever, supporting not just his immediate family, but providing employment for dozens of ranch hands and their families. But the true measure of his success wasn't in the numbers written in his ledger books. It was in the laughter that filled his house at dinner time, in the confidence he saw in Rosie's eyes when she looked at her own children, in the way James handled difficult situations with patience and wisdom, in the compassion Elizabeth and Hope showed to everyone they met. One evening, as Samuel and Mercy sat in their favorite spot on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, a young man approached the house on horseback. He was dusty from travel, his clothes worn but clean, and he held his hat respectfully in his hands as he dismounted. "Mr. Morrison," he called out. "Mrs. Morrison, my name is David Chen. I heard that you sometimes help people who need a fresh start." Samuel and Mercy exchanged glances, seeing in this young man's face the same desperation and hope they had witnessed so many times before. They learned that David had come west from San Francisco, fleeing prejudice and violence against Chinese immigrants, carrying little more than his skills as a carpenter and his determination to build a better life. Samuel asked simply. "Yes, sir," David replied without hesitation. "Are you honest?" "Yes, sir." "Then you're welcome here," Samuel said, standing to shake the young man's hand. "We'll find you a place to sleep tonight, and tomorrow we'll talk about what kind of work needs doing." As they watched David lead his horse toward the barn, guided by James who had come out to help, Mercy leaned against Samuel's shoulder. "Some things never change," she said softly. "Thank God for that," Samuel replied. The circle of kindness that had begun with a desperate auction and a lonely rancher's compassion had grown into something larger than either Samuel or Mercy had ever imagined. It had become a legacy that would outlast them both, a testament to the power of choosing love over fear, generosity over selfishness, hope over despair. On quiet evenings, when the work was done and the family gathered together, Samuel would sometimes catch Mercy's eye across the room and remember that terrified young woman clutching her baby on the auction block. The transformation was complete, but the gratitude never faded. In the end, the story of Samuel and Mercy Morrison became part of the legend of the American West, not because of dramatic shootouts or cattle drives, but because it proved that even in the harshest conditions, kindness could flourish, love could triumph, and hope could transform the most desperate circumstances into something beautiful and lasting. Their ranch became a beacon of possibility, showing that the American dream wasn't just about individual success, but about lifting others up along the way, creating communities bound together by compassion and shared humanity. The auction block where it all began eventually rotted away, replaced by a small park in the center of Millbrook. But the story lived on, passed down through generations. a reminder that sometimes the greatest victories are won not through force or cunning, but through the simple courage to extend a helping hand to those who need it most.